Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Objectivist Girl Live. Today I have Craig Haynie with me. He's a fellow board member at the New Hampshire Objectivist Society, and he's of course also an objectivist. And so today we're going to talk about the non-aggression principle and man as an end in and of himself. And so let's go ahead and get started. It's nice to have you on today, Craig.
Oh, hi, Lauren. I'm not really familiar with broadcasting, so a bit nervous over here.
That's all right. You're going to do great. So we were talking earlier about the non-aggression principle, and the reason that I invited you on is because you have such a positive view of the non-aggression principle. Most objectivists dislike it just by its very nature because it is a floating abstraction.
Right.
But you have a positive view on it, and do you want to go ahead and say your view?
My positive view is that I think it's essentially the axiom, and I know we don't like to use the word axioms as objectivists because axioms are self-referential, self-validating, but in logic, axiom is a starting point, and you have axioms in math, you have axioms in different points of logic. And as a starting point, a lot of people, the libertarians, use it as a starting point for a foundation for society. And I think that as the objectivist view of politics, the non-aggression principle is the same starting point for the political views that would encompass society. So I think it's important that we all understand that we have to learn to live with each other as equals, as political equals in society, where people can do and pursue their own values the way that they choose without harming others, and I think that's an important foundation for it.
Agreed. I think the non-aggression principle has very good merit to it just because the goal is to not harm one another, but at the same time, I feel like it's not grounded in reality. It's not based on any metaphysical point of view, and that is where I see the difference between the non-aggression principle and man as an end in and of himself.
Right, and to reinforce that, to reinforce that idea, you can see that the non-aggression principle can be arrived at from many different directions. A lot of Christians believe in the non-aggression principle. Just about everybody in the libertarian movement comes at the non-aggression principle from different directions, and so yes.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to differentiate at this point the difference between Ayn Rand's definition of an axiom and the normal dictionary definition of an axiom. Ayn Rand defines an axiom as being something that's self-evident versus normal axiom, which is defined as a starting point for an idea. That was what you were saying earlier?
Right, exactly. So when we talk about the non-aggression principle as an axiom, we mean as a starting point for the political structure of society, and that's the libertarians' starting point as well. That's the foundation for libertarianism, is the non-aggression principle.
Right, and so the difference is that Ayn Rand wanted to take her principle for how we should interact with one another from the standpoint of metaphysics, because it answers better the why. And so when you're talking to someone about the non-aggression principle and you say we shouldn't aggress, and they ask you why, it's very difficult to answer that question when you say.
Right, and in fact, Ayn Rand provides the answer by showing that man is an end in and of himself, meaning he is his own nature. He doesn't have clothes, he doesn't have fur, he doesn't have claws, he doesn't have strength, he doesn't have teeth. So he has a certain nature, though, that allows him to live. He must live by using his mind, seeking value for things in his life, and attempting to acquire those values. So this is a starting point for the non-aggression principle. Once we recognize what each person must do to live, then the non-aggression principle allows us to live with each other in society. We developed the theory of rights, and we each believe then that we have the ability to pursue our own lives as long as we don't violate these same rights in others. So that is a starting point, but as a if you're coming from to the non-aggression principle from another perspective, from another place, you're not going to have the same starting point and you essentially adopt it as a floating abstraction for whatever reason that you choose.
Right. So because existence exists, man has a right to their own life and the right to keep that life going. So therefore, man is an end in and of himself because of the fact that he is responsible for his own life and keeping his life going, and he's the only agent which can keep that going. And so because of this, man as an end in and of himself also includes that they are not a means to another man's ends. And I think this is just as important. The second part is just as important as the first part, because man as an end in and of himself just implies that we have a right to those things, but also not a means to another man's ends says we must respect that. And what do you think?
No, that's the definition of the non-aggression principle, is that you have to, first of all, define aggression. And to define aggression means that you must first define property. We have the definition of what property is. We must know what defensive force is. We must know what retaliatory force is. And we must know what preventative force is. So once we define these things, and this outlines a sphere in which we as individuals can operate, which we can pursue our values, cooperating with each other through voluntary interaction, but not violating someone else's domain, not interfering with someone else's sphere, and not violating their property rights. So you must have several things in order for the non-aggression principle to work.
Agreed, and many of those things go completely undefined. So it differs from person to person because it's different than man as an end in and of himself. The non-aggression principle simply states you should not aggress.
Right.
But what does that mean? What does that imply? Man as an end in and of himself simply says because you own your own life, you have a right to the things that protrude from that life. So property, you earn property through your life. You earn money through your life, so you have a right to that. You have a right to what that money buys you. And you have a right to not have those things taken from you, stolen from you. And that's why I like man as an end in and of himself better. And actually what we were talking about earlier, and I think you'd be interested to hear this, is that we think that it would be good to combine the two, just because grounding the non-aggression principle in man as an end in and of himself just reinforces it.
Right, it also shows the limits too. It also allows you to overcome the limits that the non-aggression principle gives you. The non-aggression principle, because it divides up our rights into individual spheres where we can operate based upon property and such, it never allows us to interfere with someone else's rights without their consent. But there are times when we, acting as individuals, will need to do this or may need to do this. If, for instance, there was an emergency that comes up and I need to steal a car to get to the hospital and save my life, then this is where we must understand that the non-aggression principle is not an axiom for objectivists. It goes back to man as an end in and of himself, and that we use it simply as a tool to live and work together, but it's not an axiom, and we therefore must, in certain cases, violate people's rights in order to come out of emergencies, to solve emergency situations.
See, I think this is where we differ. I personally am in disagreement with that. I don't think that you can ever actually steal anyone's property in order to maintain your life. But at the same time, how do you go about doing that?
Well, you can't do it through society. You can't change the non-aggression principle. You can't change the legal structure or the laws to allow anyone to do that, because there's no way to know how valuable someone's property is to them and what they're particularly using it for. For instance, if you were to say, oh my gosh, I've been bitten by a rattlesnake, I have to get to the hospital right now, and you go and you take someone's car because you can't find anybody to take you, well, you don't know why the car was sitting there, and you don't know why the keys were left in it. Maybe the guy had to run into the house to save someone else that he cared about. You don't know. You can't put value, and value is subjective to the individual, and you can't know how important something is to someone else, and you can't put the values of strangers above your own life. So as far as society goes, you can never make an exception to the non-aggression principle, but as individuals, at times I think we have to. What if you were to find yourself in an emergency situation where you actually had to do something which took someone else's property in order to live? What would you do?
See, I think this is where benevolence comes in. I think that it was technically wrong for you to steal a car, but at the same time, I think that that person, any reasonable, rational person would forgive you. And even if they didn't forgive you, you could offer them value in exchange for taking that car.
Right.
I mean, I think it's initially wrong to do that, but I think there's ways to pay retribution for that action.
Oh, certainly. Certainly. And society would have to recognize that, my gosh, you took this guy's car, you have to compensate him for that, and you do that after the fact. But at the same time, at the moment of the emergency, you don't know why that car is there. You don't know how important it is to him. And if you took the car and he was running in to get his wife and take her to the hospital and she died, then you'd be causing much greater harm than you could compensate.
Could it be argued that the person wasn't living an objective life in the first place, that they didn't have their own car?
That they didn't what?
They didn't plan for this?
Well, there's unexpected things that come up all the time. This is just one example, right? What was the example that Ayn Rand came up with? She said, what if, two people were in the ocean and there was only one life preserver? What do you do? Well, her answer is, well, when it comes down to emergency ethics, you try to solve the emergency, and you do whatever you need to do to survive. You don't give your life for a stranger when your life is important to you and has value and has meaning.
Right. I think in a good society, this would definitely come into play. I think that benevolence would be pursued here by the person whose car is stolen, and if, in worst case scenario, I think that they would accept retribution for restitution for the vehicle that was stolen. I think that in any positive society with a positive philosophy, benevolence would be a principle, and I think that it definitely comes into play here.
Oh, definitely. Most people want to help others. And if there was a book by David Kelly released, I think, in 1994 called The Unrugged Individual. Mm-hmm. And in this book, he describes benevolence as a virtue. He basically says that we want to try to help others when we have the opportunity, when we have the chance, and when it's of no serious detriment to ourselves, because we don't know how that is going to come back to us. We don't know what potential future value that person can be to us and to our lives in the future.
Right.
And if we all were to do this, give a little bit here and give a little bit there, we would build a society that that was more forgiving and provided more for us in many different ways that we probably couldn't imagine.
Agreed. I think this is a great book, and I think that it's definitely underrepresented in much of objectivist philosophy, because there are, again, two schools of thought on objectivism. There's open versus closed, but the open objectivists accept David Kelly's work and accept the principle of benevolence. The closed objectivists don't. And I think that as an open objectivist, I've embraced benevolence. It actually was the difference between open and closed for me. I do think that this is something that she's gone over. Benevolence was something she spoke of, not very largely, but it was actually in her ethics of emergencies. You can see that she was very into benevolence in the ethics of emergencies.
Right, and as open objectivists, we take the objectivist philosophy as a source of knowledge. Something that was founded by Ayn Rand, discovered, as you will, by Ayn Rand, and something that needs to be continually needs to be developed as time moves on to explore different areas of not only science but also of human relationships. The other definition of objectivism is that it's a closed system and it consists only of the opinions of Ayn Rand that she had during her lifetime, and that's the foundation for the two different types of objectivism that are out there.
Right, and the way that I differentiate between the two is that closed objectivism is based on Ayn Rand completely versus open objectivism, which states that objectivism is simply the philosophy of defining objective reality and finding and pursuing objective truths. And so I view it as a philosophy of objective truth, of pursuing objective value. I think all open objectivists do, whether they state it that way or not. And I don't think that a philosophy can be based on someone's very thought and action, because we are human beings and we make mistakes. And I think Ayn Rand made a few of them. I think I make a few of them, and more than a few of them, probably maybe even more than Ayn Rand. But you know, it's about pursuing objective reality for open objectivists.
Right. The extension of philosophy, the way philosophy can be extended is indefinite as society progresses, as we think more about different types of situations that we might find ourselves in. In terms of the law, we're going to have to figure out ways to apply the non-aggression principle to fishing rights, to outer space, to homesteading property that's in space, and that sort of thing. And so that's just one aspect of the way philosophy can be extended into the future, as well as in other areas too, in the areas of science. How do we incorporate quantum mechanics into our philosophy and different things of this nature? So the philosophy is ever expanding in different directions, and that's why I believe in open objectivism, that we should take the foundations and continue to try to develop principles based upon them.
And I think that that's also the issue that I see with the non-aggression principle, is it's the idea that we can have this abstraction that's not based on reality. When something's based on reality, it's able to form, it's able to develop with reality and what we know and based on our perceptions of it. So when we move into space, as we develop the internet, as we know more things, man as an ends in and of himself will expand because man's rights will expand. And the non-aggression principle that's not grounded in reality and only talks about force and different aspects of force. If we discover different aspects of force, we have to go back and look at it again and redefine the non-aggression principle versus simply going with man as an ends in and of himself, which allows us to move with our perceptions of reality and move with time and move with reality.
Well, that's an interesting point of view. I don't know to what extent we can modify. I can't say that correctly. I don't know to what extent we can change the non-aggression principle as a concept, as a broad concept to develop society. But I do believe that in order to have the non-aggression principle, we have to define several different things, and these definitions, such as property rights, such as the use of force, will continually change. In other words, if someone is trespassing on your property, how much retaliatory force can you have against them? Is it even considered a crime? Do you have easements? Should property have easements? Should you own the rights to minerals beneath the surface of your property? How far into the air do you control? These are things that will fluctuate and can be changed in time. But the idea itself, I think, is fundamental for people to live and work together. They have to recognize that each person is an end in and of himself, and therefore this principle should be expanded to all of us, and that is what the non-aggression principle tries to do. It tries to define room for every one of us to exercise our values, to try to find the things that are important in life for us and seek them out.
Right. And so further along that line, I define man as an ends in and of himself, not a means to another man's end, as going between individual ethics and societal ethics. And so I am kind of moving, I guess, backwards, and I'm going to start talking about ethics of objectivism, because I've been talking a lot about politics lately. And I think there are 3 aspects to societal ethics that I'm going to be going over in the next month, or maybe even longer, depending on questions and concerns. And so the 3 aspects for me, and you can let me know what you think of this, Craig.
Sure.
Is, first of all, choosing rational self-interest over altruism, and we'll define rational self-interest and altruism. Also, the principle of benevolence, and finally, mutually beneficial exchanges and their importance. And so for me, these are the 3 aspects that make up societal ethics. What do you think?
Yes, I don't know what to add to that, but sorry. But when you're living and working with other people, and you stay out of their way, you treat them with non-aggression, and you live in a world of peace. And how should this apply? I mean, what was the question?
So I want to be able to talk over the next few months about societal ethics and how man should interact with one another.
Right.
And I think those 3 aspects really break down the ethics between.
Right. Man is an instrument in and of himself, so he seeks value. He seeks things that are important to him and in his life. That's the first thing that you were talking about.
Right.
That's what I see as personal morality. I have a different way of describing these different kinds of ethics, but I see personal morality is based upon personal ethics. So a person might say, well, I don't smoke and drink because I want to live healthy, and it's immoral, therefore, to smoke and drink. But he's talking about something that he values for himself. Another person might say, well, wine is the spice of life. I'm not going to give up wine and cigarettes. And for his life, that's his moral code. So when we talk about personal morality, we go back to the individual. Man is an end in and of himself. When we then move it out to society, then benevolence comes up, and then the idea of the non-aggression principle comes up, and that's where we draw hard lines and say, well, no matter what your personal values are, the only thing that's immoral when we're talking about interpersonal relationships is a violation of the non-aggression principle, and that's why we create that. When it comes to benevolence, it's David Kelly believes it's a virtue, and I do too, and for reasons that we discussed earlier, that when you're living and working with other people, you can make the world around you and society that much better by helping others when you can and when it's possible for you to do so. So that's how I would add to it. Let's see, is there something else I wanted to say?
Mutually beneficial exchanges.
Mutually beneficial exchanges.
Yeah.
Well, that's trade, and that's the foundation for a free market, is to allow everyone to be able to trade amongst themselves and to interact with each other through consent and voluntary cooperation. And so it all ties together.
Right. And so you see the difference between rational self-interest and altruism play into both individual and societal ethics. Because I think that I truly believe, and I'm going to address this, that there's a benefit for both parties when you choose rational self-interest over altruism. I think that altruism weakens the society as a whole, and I'm going to address that. What do you think?
Well, I think you say altruism weakens society as a whole. Right? Altruism is the principle that you want to sacrifice something of value to you for someone else,
right.
in deference to your wishes and the things that are of value to you, and instead you're going to give someone else a value that you don't really believe should be traded. So no, that's not in line with objectivist thinking. And in objectivist thinking, you want to be traders. People want to trade equally with others, and therefore, by continuously seeking value independently, they both value. So in any one trade, if a person's trading $1.50 for a cup of coffee, both sides win. Otherwise, they wouldn't make the trade. It's the cornerstone to voluntary cooperation and consensus, and altruism is the opposite of that.
Yeah, altruism normally makes people want to avoid one another because they don't want to end up sacrificing it. It creates a society full of resentment for one another's existence versus rational self-interest, which creates, and combined with benevolence, it creates a society in which, and mutually beneficial exchanges. So all those three create a society in which we enjoy living together and we enjoy interactions with one another because we all end up coming away feeling good.
Right, but what kinds of values should people have? I was talking earlier about how some people might believe in being healthy, not smoking, not drinking, and some people might believe that they should live a little more freely, enjoy wine, enjoy cigarettes, and this sort of thing. What kinds of values should people have, and are there values that are fundamental to a rational individual?
Yeah, I think the real fundamental objective value is valuing life. And I think every single value comes from your value of your own life. And so when you're considering something, you have to think whether it's pro-life or anti-life. And that's the first consideration that you need to take into account.
Right, but when we start talking about that, we find that there are some things that I question about that. There are people that do things that take a lot of risk, that put a lot of risk into their lives, like Jeb Corliss, who puts on a rocket suit and he flies, jumps out of airplanes, and he flies underneath bridges, and he flies through canyons. And this is extremely risky. And in fact, his best friend died doing a jump with him like this, and it adds nothing to his survival. But yet, if you were to ask him, you would find that it's everything to him. It provides everything for his meaning of life to himself. And I don't think Ayn Rand would disapprove of this. I think she would agree with this. So I think
agree. She actually talks about that in her Ethics of Emergency. She states that it's acceptable to give your life for someone that you love, as long as their life is of greater value to you than your own. And I find that that's an interesting thing coming from her. I would have never expected that.
And I disagree with it. Actually, I disagree with Ayn Rand on this case. To give your life for another person overlooks the variable of time. Now, what she said was that if you really didn't think you could live without this person, then it's acceptable to give your life for this person. But it's overlooking how time heals all wounds, and it's overlooking how your future self might look back. We know many stories about people who grieve seriously when they lose someone who's dear to them, but they get over it and they move on. So I don't necessarily think that you can give your life for someone else.
Right, I actually agree. I don't agree with her, but it's for a little bit of a different reason. I think that because life is the reason, because you exist, you are able to value that person. You are able to value the risks that you take. So if you put your life, the ability to be able to value at risk, then you're putting all your values at risk. And so therefore I think that because all of those values stem from the basic value of life, that it's wrong and it goes against your greatest value, which is to be alive so you can pursue these things.
Right, but this is why I'm kind of conflicted on the issue, because we know that parents will give their lives for their kids, or if you ask, most parents would unhesitantly say that they would certainly sacrifice their lives for one of their kids, even though they might have several. And so I think that it's difficult to know what an individual can put into his value hierarchy, what he can accommodate, what he can, I don't know what the word is, what he can pursue is something that's extremely important to him. I think man is a complicated animal, and I think living as man qua man is somewhat of a black box, because we don't understand the nature of man as well as we would need to answer all of these questions.
No, and I think this really leads into what I'm going to be discussing in the future. I'm going to be asking these difficult questions. Was Ayn Rand right or wrong about being able to give your life for another? Would she agree with the idea that you could take risks to better your life? Is that bettering your life? What is the objective truth? And I think that this really plays into that idea that objectivism is about discovering objective truths. It's not about what Ayn Rand said, because Ayn Rand didn't have a stance on everything. And these are huge questions that I want to deal with in the coming months. And so I want to thank Craig for coming on my show. I had a lot of fun. I thought this was a great conversation.
I did too.
Awesome. Well, I hope you guys will join me next week for my next show. Who knows what it's going to be. So remember, guys, knowledge is not for all men, but for those who seek it. So keep seeking.
Bye-bye.